Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel on implementing climate change adaptation plans, which is being hosted by the Master of Sustainability's Transdisciplinary Seminar Series and by the Niagara Adapts Partnership. My name is Jessica Blythe. I'm an assistant professor at Brock's Environmental Sustainability Research Center. I'm the faculty lead for the Niagara Adapts Partnership, and I will be your facilitator for this morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which Brock is located is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. Next, I would like to extend a thank you to Amanda Smits, Erica Harper, and Michaela Jennings for organizing the session for us today, and a huge thank you to our three panelists. The panel today is obviously about implementing climate change adaptation actions, which is arguably the most important and the most challenging part of the climate adaptation planning process. We're all here and invested in this work because ultimately we want to contribute towards building more resilient communities that are able to withstand and recover from the impacts of climate change. So our goal for the panel this morning is to inspire you and to inform you, hopefully, through sharing success stories and lessons learned in implementing climate adaptation plan actions within municipalities here in Canada. So I'd like to just briefly introduce you to our three panelists who we're thrilled to have joining us this morning. Katie Thompson is a risk management official in the Business Performance and Environmental Sustainability Group with the City of Barrie. Her focal areas include drinking water source protection, climate adaptation, and assessing corporate environmental obligations. She has a unique perspective on the interrelations between the science foundation, action framework, and implementing aspects of climate change adaptation plans. She's a member of the local Climate Change Exchange Group, the Source Protection Committee, and is a professional geoscientist. Prior to joining Barrie, Katie worked at the Source Water Protection Program for the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority, where she played a significant role leading up to the development of policies in the source protection plan for the region. I hear a teeny bit of feedback. I think I'm coming through okay. Am I all right, Jacob? Okay. Thank you. Okay, so next we have Jacob. Jacob Porter is the Climate Adaptation Coordinator for the City of Thunder Bay, who's implementing the city's climate adaptation strategy. His work spans across emergency preparedness, asset management, and community planning, and depends on collaborations across city departments, partnerships with community organizations, and engagement with city residents. Over the past year, adaptation efforts in Thunder Bay have focused on a deeper recognition of the social impacts of climate events and greater involvement in emergency response planning. His experiences prior to joining the city include supporting adaptation initiatives in remote First Nation communities, designing and delivering science outreach program, and piloting helicopters, just to add to that impressive list. And third, we're thrilled to have Joanna Eyquem, who is the Director of Climate Programs for the Intact Center. Joanna is a recognized expert in climate adaptation, flood erosion management, and river restoration, with 20 years experience both in Canada and the United Kingdom. Joanna's focal areas at the Intact Center include mobilizing flood resilience for homes, new and existing communities, and commercial real estate, the protection and restoration of natural infrastructure to mitigate climate change, developing programs to limit risks of extreme heat, promoting programs to limit wildlife risk, and incorporating climate risks into institutional investing, credit rating assessments, and security disclosure. Prior to joining the Intact Center, Joanna was the Global Technical Practice Group Lead for Climate Resilience at Eyquem, which built on her previous roles in consulting with a variety of environmental and engineering firms. Joanna is a professional geoscientist, chartered water and environmental manager, and chartered environmentalist. So welcome to the three of you. We're so thrilled to have you here. Finally, I'd just like to provide a brief overview of the format of the panel. I've got a series of questions for our panelists, so we'll spend the next 50 minutes or so hearing from them and what this has looked like on the ground in the places where they've worked. Then we'll open the floor and we'll have some time for questions from the audience. So while we're going, please feel free to type questions into the chat box for panelists to answer towards the end of the event. Or if you'd like to wait and then share your questions in the chat box at the end, both of those work for us. All right, so with that, I think we'll get started. So to begin with, I'd like to ask the three of you if you could please tell us what the climate adaptation planning process has looked like for your municipality or for your organization.
All right, I can get us started. So in Thunder Bay, for our citywide climate adaptation strategy, we use the Eyquem ARC protocol to develop that. It is a 5-step planning process that helps guide people through everything from that initiation, that stakeholder engagement, that identifying champions, building up momentum, through the collection of data, the planning process and prioritizing, creating objectives, the implementation steps, and then the monitoring process after. This, of course, is like Eyquem is used by a lot of communities, which also gives us the benefit of being able to rely on other lessons learned, how other people have experienced these different stages, and really build off each other's efforts to make adaptation a success in our community. But that strategy, or sorry, that framework works quite well for a citywide, broad, high-level engagement. But then for adaptation planning in general, you also have to focus on smaller projects too, but no matter what project it is, having that broad progression where you start off with some form of stakeholder engagement, bringing in the research, the numbers, so that you get a firm understanding of the problem from multiple angles, coming up with what are your priorities, how are you going to implement it, and how do you set something up so that you can learn, monitor, and make future changes down the line.
Thanks, Jacob. And I love that focus on stakeholder engagement from the beginning and that multiple perspectives on what is the challenge, because this is multifaceted. Thanks so much. Katie or Joanna, would you like to jump in on that question?
Yeah, sure. I will unmute myself before I start speaking. So I think from the Intech Centre's perspective, we aim to be a resource that municipalities can use to help them with their adaptation planning process, and also with identifying best practice actions to reduce risk on the ground. I think the work we've done to date is particularly focused on flooding as the key climate risk in Canada. And most recently, we've tried to kind of benchmark adaptation across a number of communities, the big cities in Canada, basically to identify, according to a set of indicators, our progress in adapting and where are the opportunities to really improve our preparation for flooding. So that report was aims to really focus on what we can do to reduce kind of the consequences of flooding in our major cities, but there are lessons learned for each community, because the size of the community doesn't necessarily change the appropriate actions, so I think so and going forward, we're going to be looking more, we already have a guidance for fire, and we're looking at extreme heat and use of natural infrastructure as well, as you mentioned. So we aim to be a supporter for the municipalities.
Thanks, Joanna. That's so useful for us here in Niagara, as we are, pooling resources and trying to find locations or support for the process that we're going through. I've got somebody on the phone line off mute, and we're getting a bit of feedback from you. So if you're joining us via the phone, if you can find your mute, that would be lovely. Thank you. So over to you, Katie. What does the planning process look like in Barrie?
So similar to Jacob, this city has also followed the Eyquem BARC methodology. But prior to that, our city held a Building Municipal Resilience in Central Ontario conference. It was spawned by our mayor's office. And that was sort of the launching point for most of our work. From there, we decided we needed to do a framework to really figure out where the city wanted to go. We really liked the BARC framework because it had the 5 milestones, and the process provided a really good process for getting a lot of work done quickly. It forced a lot of members of the organization to come together, put all of our cards out on the table, work through some of the challenges, and make some decisions and a plan to go forward rather quickly without focusing too much on perfecting the science, perfecting our plans. It was more to just get us started, and with the continuous feedback loop, that gave us a level of comfort that we don't have to be perfect right out of the start gate. We always have the opportunity to go back and start again.
Thank you, Katie. And I realize it's you on the phone, so please stay on. Thank you. That's so interesting too, because clearly these planning processes get sparked by a number of different things. You know, it's not always the same pre-planned process. So I love your insight on how, you know, it was sparked in Barrie. Thank you. Okay, so next we wanted to sort of ask the question, why are municipalities so important in this climate adaptation process, and why are they often the right group to be implementing adaptation actions?
Maybe I can kick off on this one. So I think the key thing about adaptation is that we need to mainstream, really, and we need to mainstream into urban planning, long-term asset management that's already being undertaken by municipalities. So in that sense, municipalities are doing the work that needs to be integrated. So it makes perfect sense for them to be the kind of the ball carrier for adaptation. And I think we need to focus on both built and natural assets going forward. And I think the other thing is the responsibility. For example, flooding, the responsibility is often held at the provincial level, but officially delegated to the municipality. So being that that's the biggest risk in Canada, having the municipalities being responsible to adapt to flood risk, that's where we're at the moment. Though we do see movement towards more strategic river basin scale approaches, because obviously since our river basins are all interconnected, we cannot take the actions that involve a more systems approach if we don't consider the river basin scale. So we see groups of municipalities grouping together with kind of county level or river basin authorities, depending which province we're in Canada. So we see that shift towards, and obviously in Ontario with the conservation authorities, they're already responsible for flood risks. So, but it's not the case in all provinces.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joanna. That really resonates with some of our experiences here in Niagara. Is a couple of things. I love this sort of multi-scalar nature that you're talking about, and that's obviously something that's motivated our approach here to work with the 7 municipalities on these shared challenges that extend across municipal borders, and so that really resonates. And then also I love your point about mainstreaming the climate adaptation portfolio across everything that municipalities are doing, and that's something that sounds familiar to us here, you know, because clearly it influences all facets of municipal service delivery. Thank you. Jacob or Katie, would you like to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I'd like to build off of Joanna's point a little bit, where for climate adaptation, a lot of the responses are under city control and are related to ongoing city actions. When it comes to stormwater, we maintain a lot of the stormwater infrastructure. That is our responsibility. Our urban planning is under mostly city control. But at a broader level, why municipalities, no matter where these powers lie. Right? It's because that even though climate change is this broad global problem, the impacts are a local experience, and they can be quite different from community to community, and the responses to those impacts can be very different. So when it comes to flooding, what types of flooding, and whether we're talking about riverine or pluvial or urban flooding, and how we respond to it. In Thunder Bay, we're also lucky that most of our river basins, our watersheds are within the city of Thunder Bay limits. So we collaborate with our conservation authority and don't have to do too much integrating with others. But we also have a great wealth of natural assets, a good urban forest, and enough open space that we can really respond to some of these risks with green infrastructure, low impact developments, bioretention basins that might not be as feasible in a larger, more urbanized community. And as well, in our climate adaptation efforts, we notice that we experience impacts that aren't necessarily reflective of impacts elsewhere. We have newly become an area for black-legged ticks, so we are now a Lyme disease risk area, whereas previously they were not able to overwinter very well in Thunder Bay. We are frequent hosts of evacuations from northern communities. So when flooding, when forest fires threaten communities in almost all of Ontario's far north, they are typically evacuated to centres like Thunder Bay and Timmins. And very few places have that several hundred people a year. So usually 2, 3, sometimes 4 communities are hosted as evacuations each and every year in a medium-sized community like us. So as we move forward, it's really important for municipalities to be engaged in this because they are best positioned to react to what are the local impacts, what are the local problems, to do the engagement of stakeholders who this is actually affecting, whether or not that be your emergency services, whether this be the people who are evacuated, the healthcare, what is actually changing, and be able to implement those responses for our emergency planning, infrastructure, and community planning.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Those are such fascinating examples because the flooding really resonates with what we're experiencing here in Niagara and the spread of, the shift of species habitats, ranges, and Lyme disease spreading further north. Those are things that are, as you highlight rightly, municipalities are really on the front line of responding to that. When people have a flood in their neighborhood, they call the city, and it's on you guys to respond to that, and then obviously think proactively to prepare for that. But to me, the example of northern communities being evacuated to you is something that's quite different from our experience. And of course, that would be the case, but it wasn't something that was on my radar. So I love that, and it's so important for us to hear from municipalities that are in a slightly different context than we are. So thank you for those really important examples of why municipalities are such an important player in implementing adaptation. Katie, would you got some reflections on why municipalities are such an important actor in this space?
I would echo a lot of what Jordan and Joanna have said. I would add that municipalities, we're at the level where we're able to adapt and be more nimble. So we have a better pulse on our community and what the local needs are. Maybe unique to Barrie is we're an urban growth center. So we have a lot of stormwater challenges, growth, making sure our infrastructure is designed really for the future with a lot of these climate change situations in mind. Our waterfront is a big focus of our community and making sure that's protected and still usable by the public. We don't want to see bacteria and pathogen growth down at our beaches, coming off of developments or from stormwater ponds just out in the community. We're prone to a lot of winter weather, lots of wind. So just making sure our parks and our tree canopies are protected and maintained so that people can enjoy those outdoor spaces and they don't pose a safety hazard. There's lots of challenges and unique pieces that fall to more of a local level.
Yeah, thanks for those examples, Katie. That's something that we've experienced here in Niagara as well. Pelham, which is one of our 7 participating partners, for example, had these iconic sort of arches in the main downtown core where outdoor festivals were held, and they were damaged beyond repair in a recent windstorm. So that's an example of you know, a similar type of challenge that we're dealing with here in Niagara as well. Thank you all. Okay, so we're thinking about why municipalities are such an important player in this space. And here in Niagara, most of the partners that we are working with are finalizing their adaptation plans, and they're looking forward to how do we implement these actions that we've spent so much time researching and developing and consulting with people in the region. So can you share with us what are the main sort of successes that you've experienced? And also, what factors do you think led to those or supported those successes?
I can start this one. So for us, we really focused on having a cross-departmental adaptation team. And that team provided a lot of input into the plan itself. And they've been really helping us to drive implementation forward in their own respective areas. Having this cross-departmental team has been a great resource for us, particularly sharing of information and understanding what each department focus area is doing. And it's been helping us to break down some of those siloed work areas so that we can really get some of the actions done. We've had a lot of success in starting with the quick win actions, so the low-hanging fruit, things that we can cross off. And this was particularly easy to accomplish where an action was in alignment with the current work the department was doing or something that they were planning for in the very near future. Generally, we've found that climate change is top of mind for a lot of our departments, and a lot of great work is being done to incorporate the actions when possible. And what might be of particular interest to this group is around the same time we were doing our plan, our local health unit was doing their adaptation plan, and some of the conservation authorities as well. So we formed a local climate change exchange group, and it ranges from the health unit, all of the municipalities in Simcoe, Muskoka, our environmental associations, the school board, and Indigenous organizations. And we meet quarterly to talk about what we're doing. We talk about both adaptation and mitigation. And our members range from planners to technical staff to those doing education and outreach. And it just gives a really good forum to troubleshoot problems, share ideas. We often take what someone else has done and figure out if we could adopt it at our own municipality. And recently this group has been developing a charter to sort of guide our collective goal forward for a connected, broader sustainable community that's resilient to climate change. So we're working on a charter, and we have some foundation pillars. But the biggest value of this group is just being able to reach out, know who your colleagues are at other organizations, and share those resources back and forth. Often a trouble you're having, someone else is going through the same thing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Katie. That really resonates here as well. And I love that idea of and the group that you're describing is so transdisciplinary, you know, with many different partners. I love the school board was in there, for example. That's like not one of the common players you think of, but is obviously so important. Not to put you on the spot, but just thinking of where we are in Niagara, can you think of any specific examples of those quick wins that you talked about, or the actions that were aligned with work that was already ongoing in different examples? In different departments?
Sure. So we've started around the same time our adaptation plan came out. Some of our asset management plans were being updated, And I think concurrently a piece of provincial direction was coming down that said climate change is to be considered as part of your asset management planning, particularly for stormwater. And we were able to work with the team, and they were able to incorporate the objectives of their actions in our plan and some of our performance measures. So it's in alignment there. We've had some other examples in our parks department where they've been able to sort of take an audit of and plan for upcoming work. Sorry, the thought has lost my mind.
No, the asset management is a great example, and that notion that some of these things are coming from the provincial scale downwards, some of them are coming bottom up from requests from local residents. So that was a perfect example. Thank you. Okay, Joanna or Jacob, reflections on where you've been successful and what you attribute to those successes.
Yeah, I can continue on the. I'd like to continue on the quick wins, which kind of links into the kind of successes as well for the Intech Center. So we've focused a lot on kind of empowering residents to take action themselves and producing kind of resources for the general public to kind of so that they can appreciate specific risks around their house and simple DIY actions that they can actually take to reduce risk, so that at least we have kind of a basic risk awareness and, kind of similar to how you would inspect your house before you buy it. We've developed like an inspection service to look at flood risks. So I think these actions are some of those quick wins that municipalities can basically just share these resources with their citizens and empower their citizens to take action themselves. So that was one element I wanted to bring. And then the other element was looking at working with industry and private sectors. The Intech Center has been trying to train kind of trusted professionals like mortgage brokers, insurance brokers, and home inspectors so that they can help their clients who are already like talking to them about buying a house, like at the point of sale is a good time to kind of take stock of flood risk in a particular property. Working with commercial real estate associations like BOMA Canada and RealPEC, so that private sector are also doing their part alongside the municipality, and that's something maybe municipalities could reach out to the associations in their jurisdiction if to see how they could help. And engagement with the financial community as well. There's more and more interest at the moment in ESG performance, sustainable finance, investment in resilience. So these are for smaller communities. Maybe this is seen as a bit of a challenge, but there is really a distinct interest in kind of making these impact investing. And for example, we're hosting a webinar on natural capital with the Finance Montreal, and so the investors are asking for this stuff. So I think one of the things municipalities can do is kind of think about how to kind of get a mechanism where investors can invest in resilience or in natural capital in their community and work with the financial sector.
Thanks for those examples, Joanna. And that's one of the places where the Intech Center has obviously been incredibly innovative and a leader in the country in terms of tapping into or connecting with actors which we have traditionally overlooked, such as corporate actors in the finance sector, insurance and mortgage brokers. So we love that work and it's so important. I also love your comment, and just I might ask you for a few specific examples. I love the work that you're doing as well on empowering homeowners to reduce risks around their house and very cost-effective and simple kind of actions they can take. And thinking to our audience, the resources are on the Intech Web Center and they'll be able to find them. But could you give one or two examples? If I'm a homeowner and I'm worried about flood risk, what type of actions are you recommending?
I think two of the key ones are kind of people finding out if they have a sump pump. Kind of understanding how your house works. So a lot of people don't know even if they have a sump pump or not. So, and if they don't know they have it, they're obviously not maintaining it. And the same goes for the backwater valve, which the backwater valve is basically a piece of equipment that stops water backing up from the sewer once the urban drainage network is overwhelmed by intense rainfall. And the sump pump is basically the equipment that pumps water out of your basement. So a lot of people we speak to don't know what equipment they have. So just understanding how your house works and kind of simple actions like raising valuables off the floor in the basement, or making sure that they're not in the basement to start with. It sounds very simple, but can make a big difference to the amount of damage done in case of a flooded basement.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think those really tangible examples make the conversation really real. And I love that you point out as well, I know this number comes from the Intech Center, but I know you guys have published the average cost of basement flooding in Canada is somewhere in the ballpark of $40,000. So thinking about simple actions that we can take, which we mightn't have even thought of, to reduce risk in homes. I love those examples. Thank you. Jacob, successes in Thunder Bay.
Absolutely. And building off of both Joanna and Katie, a lot of the successes are based on this ongoing relationship development, these ongoing partnerships with the stakeholders, with the people who are going to be using the data, who are affected by it, right? Whether it be through the climate change exchange or through the individual partnerships or outreach focused data industry. In Thunder Bay, we have a partnership between the city and community we call Earth Care Thunder Bay, where we do try and bring in those city employees, the community stakeholders and organizations and interested citizens on each of the 11 pillars of our sustainability plan, and including climate adaptation, in our water working group, to try and combine those actions and move things forward that way. But I'm actually going to return to one of Joanna's earlier points on the importance of mainstreaming in municipalities, where I think Thunder Bay has done quite a good job of working it into the plans, the strategies that are ongoing, that are being developed. When Thunder Bay developed our official plan recently, we released it, climate adaptation is now one of the 4 pillars of our official plan, alongside sustainability, health, and economy. It's a central focus of that plan. And we've also worked it in with our asset management. As Katie mentioned Ontario Reg 58817 means that we have to do some degree of that, but being able to really incorporate it and develop these connections and be proactive about it gets a better result for the community. And over time, we've also worked it in stormwater management plan, obviously. Our transportation master plan includes it. And a big one that has been deeply involved this year has been emergency planning. What happens if we have an extreme weather event during COVID? How do we respond? How do we really react to these events? And why is it so important to have these relationships throughout the organization, throughout the community? Because when we're talking about climate adaptation and the fact that it affects all of these different areas, no one person is an expert in all of it. No one person can implement all the actions by themselves, whether or not you have a cross-departmental team like Katie does. So to try and implement and try and get some of these successes, these actions, we've really worked to develop climate champions in different areas of the city with different expertise, different talent, different concerns. And they have really been instrumental in making sure that climate adaptation is a central concern when these plans are developed in the actions that the city takes. So, because I need a planner who knows how to react to these risks. I need engineers who know how to react to these risks. So this ongoing collaboration, this ongoing work to get climate adaptation considered a central part of operations and not an add-on or a check mark is is an integral part of getting climate adaptation implementation success.
Thanks, Jacob. That's so inspiring, actually, and that's such a huge success. Is that one of the 4 pillars being climate as a main sort of headline item is massive, and it can happen quickly. I've found climate change used to be considered quite politicized and quite somewhat taboo in a way, but you can, with the kinds of communication and outreach that you are all talking about and having those conversations and saying, like, it's really about protecting people from flooding, protecting people or preparing them for power blackouts like we've seen in Texas. These are coming and they're happening. And when you start having those kinds of conversations, we do see a shift, sometimes relatively quickly, where it goes from being an issue that's a little bit contentious towards an issue that is, of course, has to be mainstreamed. And I'm thrilled to hear that in Thunder Bay, and we need examples like that to inspire us that these things can happen and they can be mainstreamed. They need to be. So I love that. And your comment on emergency preparedness obviously really resonates this year as well. The pandemic has shown us, and these, in the Texas blackouts, and we are continuing to be exposed to shocks that are related to climate or that intersect with climate. So I love the focus on that as well. Thanks. Okay, so those are really useful success stories, and we need those. But we've promised a frank conversation about the challenges, because clearly this is a challenging space. And in many ways, developing a plan is kind of the easy part. Implementing the plan and getting change on the ground, it can be incredibly challenging. So next, I'd like you to reflect on or share, if you will, what are some of the main challenges that you have experienced, and what might help you overcome those in the future?
I can start us off. So although in Barrie we've had some success with implementing our quick wins, over this past year we went through a major organizational reorganization. So all of the divisions and departments are not as they were when we developed the plan. At the same time, we've had a lot of staff come up for retirement. So we've had a bit of knowledge loss, a lot of figuring out what everyone's new roles and responsibilities are to work through. Our plan is still very new on the implementation side, so it's yet to become sort of a main priority, and then making that knowledge transfer sometimes is challenging when we're dealing with different players than before. And if someone has stepped down and retired, that knowledge may have been lost over time. To overcome these barriers, one of the big things will be time and continuing to reach out and have one-on-one meetings with our new department branches and reps to reestablish those key contacts across the organization. And then working on identifying key priorities and competing priorities across the organization and bringing those into alignment have been some of the struggles we've been dealing with. So working through those will be key, and just being there and that resource to talk to other departments will be very helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I know that that's something that we all experience in the municipal space, is this sort of turnover of staff or reorganization of positions, or and your point about the loss of knowledge, that and it speaks to your point, Jacob, about the champions, is if your champion retires, that's a massive setback. And Katie, I just would like to throw it back to you. I know you mentioned, so I'm thinking about how do we overcome this loss of knowledge, or how do we ensure that climate mainstreaming continues and is bigger than any one individual? I know you mentioned one-on-one meetings as an effective way to kind of catch people up. Are there others that you can think of? And do you have any other strategies that you're either trying or brainstorming to try and ensure that that climate knowledge is bigger than any one person?
Yeah, so concurrently at the moment, we're sort of transitioning from the climate change adaptation strategy being more of a project at the city to more of an ongoing program. So we're trying to think about what our roles and responsibilities are, how we can be of service to various departments across the organization to make sure adaptation is factored into those decisions. So we're kind of at the early drawing board of that.
Cool, that's very exciting. That's sort of like Thunder Bay prioritizing it as one of the sort of key focal areas and making sure climate adaptation is not just a project that finishes, but that is something that continues and is ongoing. Is very encouraging. Joanna or Jacob on challenges and how we might tackle them.
I'll just quickly build on Katie's points. So of course, that whole feature of retirement or losing that knowledge base, or as using the terminologies in the last one, losing a climate champion in an area can really hurt continued implementation and trying to get this joined in a wholesome manner. But even when you do have those climate champions in place, someone who really wants to integrate climate adaptation, who really wants to make this change in their operations, can see the benefits of it, which, again, you sometimes have to work to develop that and to really get them to appreciate that. But even when they are convinced, it can be difficult for them to find the capacity, either just in their own time, their department's time, in their funding. As you have an organization that is designed to maintain things, to keep things going in one direction, sometimes it's difficult to implement these larger changes. So when people are looking at this, they don't want to, like, if you're going to spend the effort, it's hard to do something that is seen as unproven, that could have, like, it's a higher risk where this is going to take time, this is going to take money, and we don't know if it's going to have this positive outcome that we want. Or are we just spending this time on this just to say that we've done it? So in our organization, one of the big ways that we work to address this is that I kind of get a fun, unique role where I get to work with different departments. I get to float around different departments rather than staying in one area and help catalyze some of these changes. Add my capacity to help them shift from the status quo and responding to the daily emergencies to managing to make a transition that will hopefully make their jobs easier long term. And when we talk about that risk and trying to make these innovations seem less risky, there are a couple of ways that really help out with that. One is external funding, like we can sometimes get from FCM, different levels of government, sometimes even smaller philanthropic organizations, which reduce that investment into a risk. But also another way is to show that this has worked before, that it has worked. And I definitely depend on resources like the Intact Center's reports for sharing those lessons, for sharing those successes, so that we can build on the lessons learned in other communities and hopefully learn from other people's mistakes, like sometimes rather than just our own mistakes.
Thank you so much for those examples, Jacob. That I know those are going to be useful strategies for us here in Niagara. One that stands out is how you mentioned accessing little pools of funding where we're able to in order to pilot and then demonstrate the efficacy of an action to build confidence, because we are sometimes working in an environment where there's still pushback or skepticism about, is this going to work? Is it worth the money? How many dollars will I get on the dollars spent? And all of those types of questions. And so yeah, I appreciate those strategies on how we kind of overcome that. And I know we all share this frustration, but I can think to that little political comment where there's a guy in the audience saying, but what if this is all a hoax? And then the guy up on stage has got a list of like 25 beneficial outcomes for municipalities if we take these actions. You know, these actions are always going to be great for communities, and it's unfortunate that we still receive, but why should we do this? And
that constant argument. What if we create a better world all for nothing?
Yeah, and I take your point seriously as well about the need to shift from this reactive, like just responding and putting out fires, to more long-term proactive thinking. And I love your point that ultimately this is going to make people's jobs easier and make the community more safe. But switching that and getting those perspectives shifted forward and more proactive is still an ongoing challenge, I know, for many of us. Joanna, over to you. Oh, sorry, Jacob,
Sure.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
I just want to add a quick point about trying to recruit some climate champions and trying to get this done more often. Another little success that we've had, which just thought of, is that we do include in corporate orientation, I pretty much present to every single new employee coming in to the corporation about what we do, about climate adaptation, about climate change, and try and engage them and try and identify people who are just coming into the community, into the organization, as people who might be willing to be more engaged in the process. So even as you start losing people to retirement, there's also people coming in, which present new opportunities for new climate champions.
I love that idea, Jacob. That mainstreaming of everybody gets the information as they come in is brilliant. Thank you. Joanna, over to you.
Sure. So I think one of the challenges that we have for climate adaptation is it's kind of like the second cousin to climate mitigation at the moment on the political and kind of funded kind of action. We see in kind of federal, provincial, and often municipal plans that most of the money and attention is being given to reducing greenhouse gases and reaching net zero, which is obviously very important, but we need to also urgently get on with adaptation as well, because we're beyond the point of not having impacts. So I think that's one thing that the InTech Center is trying to, always work at, is to keep adaptation on the agenda. Obviously, the financial sector has really got hold of the greenhouse gas reduction in terms of, diverting funds to low carbon economy. But we would like to see more funds diverted towards resilience and kind of building or maintaining our natural capital as well, to, so that we reduce the impacts of climate change, which is effectively irreversible. And I think the other we've touched on slightly is the cost of action in a time of pandemic. Obviously, there are certain actions that are low cost and we can just get on with doing them. So I think this argument, that it's going to cost us money, some of these kind of community engagement actions or just distributing information are quite low cost, and we can get on with doing them despite the fact everybody is very cash strapped at the moment. And then the other point I would like to make is that on the loss of knowledge, I think one thing that we're also trying to work on is kind of integrating climate adaptation into standards and standardizing process, so that there's obviously a kind of a recognized and accepted way of that things should be done. For example, the standard on basement flooding, that's a national standard. There's a national standard on flood resilient community design. But the challenge is making people aware of these standards, and then when they're procuring services, asking that the standards are applied. So I think that because some of the the standards are them are more voluntary standards than required standards. Obviously, the building code is being updated as we speak, so that's a big issue. But just kind of keeping pace with standards and making sure that codes reflect climate change needs is a kind of a big part of our work too. And I think that's that would help make sure that we have a consistent approach to how we're dealing with it across different communities.
Thank you for those examples, Joanna, and yeah, they really resonate with us as well, aren't they? And I guess we're thrilled that the InTech Center has been fighting to keep adaptation as jockeying for position with mitigation. We know that that's an ongoing challenge. I teach a climate change class in our graduate program, and this afternoon we're reading a few articles on the Paris Agreement. And one of the articles argues that it did sort of elevate the status of adaptation, and we have seen it elevated in subsequent IPCC reports, but it's still always secondary to mitigation. So that's a huge challenge for all of us that we take seriously. Okay, I think I'd like to ask one more question of the three of you, and then we'll get some questions that are coming in from the audience. So being optimistic and looking forward, what would you like to see in the climate adaptation space for municipalities? Let's say in the next 5 to 10 years. What gives you hope in that space, or what would you love to see?
Maybe I can kick off this one. I think a lot of our communities have been going through the adaptation planning phase. And so what we're really looking forward to is the implementation, which is the and the action on the ground to reduce risk. And we're, certain communities are further through the process than others. But I think, looking forward, it's really, we're going to see the fruits of all the work that's been doing on the planning side, on the actually reducing the risk side. And so that's what I'm really looking forward to and excited to work with communities on. And then I think the other thing that I'd really like to see is a more whole of society approach, because I think governments, local governments, provincial governments take the responsibility, but we don't necessarily have this integration with the people themselves and the private sector and the financial sector all working in the same direction. So I think there's more work to do on kind of getting support from actors that are not necessarily seen as partners at the moment. So I think we'll see a lot more work being driven from kind of where the money is going, basically.
I like that that would be really encouraging if we see more action in that space. And I love your focus as well on, we've done good planning, but we need to see action happening. And so the focus on implementation being the real priority in the coming years is really so important. And I'm glad you emphasized that.
And maybe to just add as well, I think the other thing we're seeing is a kind of a widening of the focus from net adaptation to see the win-win-win approaches that we can have. So kind of approaches that help with adaptation that also help with natural infrastructure, for example, and natural capital. So in particular, so that we're tackling adaptation, but thinking about the wider benefits for society as well.
Yeah, I love that. And that would be ideal. And in theory should be an easier sell is we can be tackling multiple challenges in the climate space and more broadly with the kinds of actions that are being proposed in these plans. Yeah, thanks, Joanna.
I can go next. I'd like to see climate adaptation become more normalized in our decision-making process, that everything's being filtered through that climate change lens, that we have sort of more of our bigger overarching policies in place to really help facilitate that going forward, and that we can really get rid of those competing priorities, and that this really becomes the focus of our work going forward.
Yeah, I love that, Katie. The normalization of that it is constantly a lens through which all decisions are made at the municipal scale would be brilliant. And so I love that. That's a great note to sort of leave us with from Barrie's perspective. Jacob, over to you.
Yeah, so with climate adaptation, again, Joanna mentioned how sometimes that mitigation and adaptation seem to compete against each other, but I'm going to steal a quote from the insurance industry and say that they're two sides of the same coin. Adaptation is managing the unavoidable, what we're already experiencing, what we're going to experience in the future, whereas mitigation is that avoiding the unmanageable. How do we avoid the consequences that we can't adapt to quick enough. So there's definitely opportunities to combine and to work together on these actions, and both of them are necessary to succeed as communities. And when we're talking about climate impacts, or as we're talking about what changes are coming, we have to remember that even though we often approach this from a technical standpoint, our levels of service, our infrastructure, our resources that help us respond, at the end of the day, what we're concerned about is what are the impacts on people, on the community. So one area where I see a lot of growth for climate adaptation is to have a greater recognition of these social aspects. Climate change is not fair. The people who experience the greatest impacts, the greatest changes to their lives, are the people who are vulnerable for other reasons, where the social determinants of health, where are the housing, the relations, the social relations aren't there to support them. So as we are working to manage this risk, so with the climate hazard, with being that climate hazard, the risk is you have the vulnerability, the capacity, or exposure to these different hazards, creating the risk. By looking at the social aspects, by trying to integrate those into the responses that we make as a community, as a municipality, informing the broad partnerships and collaborations that help us look and understand these problems. I think that's an area where climate adaptation has a tremendous amount of room to grow and to really fill out and make the more holistic approach to climate adaptation moving forward.
Thank you all. Those are three different and incredibly important focal areas for us as an adaptation community going forward, and it would be so inspiring, and hopefully we get to that so that implementation is happening across scales and faster than we see it happening currently, and climate adaptation is mainstreamed and normalized across all decision making and sort of action at the municipal scale and other scales. And then that focus on the equity piece that you raise as well, and the specific attention to social determinants of vulnerability and particularly marginalized groups. I love all of those. I would love to see that action in all three of those spaces and across. So I think we'll start taking some questions from the audience. There have been some rolling in. So let's see. Maybe we'll start with a question from Shannon, who's one of the graduate students in our program. She says the indicators for mitigation can be more straightforward and easier to quantify, such as tons of greenhouse gas reductions. But what are some of the indicators for adaptation, and how do we implement and then monitor progress in that space? Joanna.
Yeah, maybe I can go with that. So I think what happens often in the adaptation space is we get caught up with our indicators, because you can look at exposure to risk, you can look at consequences of risk, as in kind of damages, or and you can look at action. So often we see indicators kind of being a mixture of those three elements, or you can also look at residual risks, because all of this is kind of effectively risk management. I think we get caught up with the terminology sometimes, and kind of the indicators, as you say, are a little bit messed around. So I think there is the Pan-Canadian framework on climate change, on the adaptation, does kind of give a good foundation for looking at indicators. And there's actually, I think there's a project ongoing at the moment at the federal level to specifically look at targets. And I know different municipalities, for example, I'm working with the City of Montreal, that is what we are specifically doing, is developing indicators, because they have their new climate plan and they want to track progress on specific measurable indicators. So, but I anticipate that they might be indicators of reduced consequence or indication of action on the grounds, because there's different ways that we can reflect how we're making progress.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joanna. And then Jacob, I'll throw it over to you. But the point you make about the reduced consequence or the reduced risk is definitely one of those challenges in the space, because part of what we're trying to measure is something that didn't happen, that we've avoided negative impact. But I appreciate also your comment on the sort of messiness of the language around indicators and how it's going to be tracked. And I know it's important because many of our municipal partners are right now finalizing indicators that will form the monitoring and evaluation component of their plans. Jacob, over to you.
No, I just updated our indicators in the past year. So well, I've been thinking about this quite a lot. But as Joanna was saying, there are different levels that you can monitor this progress on whether it be the consequences, whether it be the exposure, the hazard. And the problem with measuring those consequences, as Jessica said, is how do you measure, is there something wrong that didn't happen? But and also some of the events we're trying to prepare for by definition are extreme. So if we're looking on a year-by-year basis, seeing, oh, there were no extreme rainfall storms, or we didn't declare a state of emergency based on weather, that doesn't give us very useful information to respond to plan to. And so a way that we've approached this is we've split it into a few different factors. One is that, what is the climate hazard side? What is our exposure? So that might be the amount of weather warnings, even and have the current concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, like what is going into that equation of risk, saying these are the problems that are happening. Some are on the consequence stage where we're saying, okay, we're hosting this many evacuees per year. But in the middle, we have to think of it as a theory of change model. What can we measure between this hazard and the risk if we aren't measuring that end product? So we can measure what is our progress on implementing these actions. So for instance, the amount of hectares of catchment area that our LIDs have each year as we continue to grow that. We can measure what are some of the vulnerability aspects. We have a low-income measure after tax and the social inclusion, or the sense of social inclusion, which is part of our municipal citizen satisfaction survey. So once we look at kind of that risk equation and try and break down these different parts, how are we measuring what's changing? And if we can't measure the end result, or if it's not practical, how do we measure the progress that we've made to that point to try and get a holistic picture of what our risk is and what our progress is on adaptation in our community?
Thank you. I might go to another question, which is coming from Bonnie Maney, who is a graduate of our graduate program and is currently the climate coordinator for Pelham in the Niagara region. So Bonnie asks, how does scale influence implementation? And is it more feasible on a smaller scale, like a town? Many of the municipalities that we work with, range between 20 to 130,000 people, or in a setting like a big city like Montreal. And maybe what are some ways that smaller municipalities like the ones in Niagara can overcome some of these small scale challenges?
I love this question about scale. It's something I've been interested in a lot over my career. And I think the answer is we need to work at a variety of scales. And we're pretty good at working at kind of individual building and municipal scales, but when it comes to kind of pushing to look at river basin, like actually working at a river basin system scale or a coastal cell scale, we have a little bit to learn still in Canada to how things actually work, because municipalities on their own cannot act at that scale, but the money is coming into the municipal scale at the moment in Canada. I think that the idea of scale kind of also brings to me the you mentioned the kind of smaller communities. Often we see the need for kind of strengthened linkages between people living downstream and people living upstream. Often we have catchments where the municipality or the urban areas are downstream of agricultural or forested lands. And so the management of those lands really impacts on the level of risk. I mean, we're talking about flooding, obviously for extreme heat, that's not so much the case, but for these risks to be dealt with, there needs to be an incentive really to for people to manage their land in a sensitive manner, to benefit people who are not on their land, basically. And I just noticed actually that today the government in Quebec actually approved funding for kind of a sustainable agricultural package, basically to reward farmers who manage their land in a manner that is sensitive to environmental purposes, which I think is something you can tell by my accent. I'm from the UK, but it's something that is environmental stewardship is a defined funding stream for farmers, and has been for over, I don't know, 20 years or so. So this idea of kind of payment for ecosystem services, I think, is something we'll see grow in the future and will help us tackle at a larger scale.
Thanks, Joanna. That's such a useful example. I was going to ask you what would incentivize behavior, and then you gave us a perfect example of that. And so, you know, funding for sustainable agricultural practices to get collaboration happening across our larger scales is a really brilliant example. And yeah, hopefully something we see more of and can learn from other countries and places where it's working well. Thank you. Katie, do you have any comments on that scalar issue?
I would add, like, picking a project and starting there, pilot something. Don't focus on trying to do everything all at once. You're not going to get very far fast. Pick a project that you really want to champion and push it forward and get that success, build that momentum, and keep it going.
Thank you. I love that. Jacob.
But just for a view of scale, sometimes it seems intimidating when a larger community seems to have this larger capacity and adaptation team. I know in smaller communities that can be just one person, but with that less total capacity, there's also the idea that a smaller ship is easier to turn. Rather than working between very large teams, that person can form a relationship with one person in another department, one person in another area, and get these changes implemented and potentially get these larger change happening more quickly than might be possible in a larger community, even though they may have more people working on the problem.
Thank you. That's a really useful comment for us here in Niagara, which tend to be on the sort of smaller scale side. Okay, we've got another question from John Anderson, who I know works with climate action teams in Grey Bruce County. In a recent study, a key barrier to implementing climate action plans is low climate literacy, particularly amongst senior staff and counselors. Can you share with us successful strategies that you've used to increase climate literacy, and maybe particularly at that sort of council scale?
I can start with this one. So I think this is a key aspect, and it's not just in kind of municipalities, it's in boardrooms and kind of in professions as well. So we're working on the BRACE funded projects, which is building capacity in climate adaptation through, and we're looking at specifically at engineers, architects, and planners, so professional associations, and basically providing training to those specific groups to show how they can implement climate adaptation in their day-to-day work. On the kind of the council level, I think we in Quebec here, we have the Union of Municipalities of Quebec, who have been proactive in training their own elected officials, directors. So these kind of municipal groups, I guess the AMO, Association of Municipalities of Ontario, would be the analogous group in Ontario. I see those groups playing a key role because they obviously cater for the needs of mayors and councillors, and can be proactive on this front. And I know AMO did recently publish guidance on climate adaptation as well on their website. So I think working with those groups to provide training is, and also I love Jacob's example of the kind of the climate champions, and it's there is a similar system in Montreal here as well, of people kind of having specific training as they to be ambassadors within the municipality, and I think that's a great idea.
Thanks, Joanna. Yeah, over to you, Jacob.
And those are excellent points on how those collaborations help build that knowledge. But sometimes for a lot of these decision makers, well, I would love to teach them until they are all experts in all aspects of climate change. And that's not the most feasible option sometimes. And so for building that climate literacy to overcome some of these barriers, there's the targeted communications, whether it be to the planners, engineers that Joanna was talking about, where you really focus on the audience's values. What have they experienced? What have they seen? How does this impact their work immediately? Helps you really get higher value out of this education, out of this work to build, well, if not general climate change literacy, climate change comfort, and the ability to act on it within the context of their concerns, their work. And this is whether it's for an engineer or a professional within your organization or with a member of the public. This is why flooding comes up so often in terms of climate change and helps get more action going. When you start to see the changes, when you start to realize that this isn't an abstract scientific environmental concept, which was the source of a lot of political back and forth before, this is a practical concern that people have to acknowledge as part of their work. I think that's where we start to see people start engaging more with the information and to start learning and building that literacy on how this impacts or is expected to impact their work moving forward, and can help overcome those temporary barriers, hopefully temporary.
I'll go with temporary. I like that. And yeah, thank you both for those comments. I love the point about connecting with people and what does this actually look like for your job or for your family or for your neighborhood. So it's not a big global percentage and projections, but it's real stuff that you are experiencing, and then how, tangible things that you can do to prepare and incorporate that into the things that you care about. Jacob, while I've got you, there's a question that's specifically for you. It comes from Allison Clark, who is a graduate student in our program who works in the north in Canada. Her question is, would you be able to tell us how often northern communities are being evacuated, and have you seen an increase in these evacuations in recent years?
Yeah. So I think one of the large challenges is that it is extreme events that we are talking about. So, and trying to monitor total amount of communities being evacuated is, like, when we're talking 2 or 3, hard to lay that out as a correlation and a trend. But we can say that almost every year, or this is partly due to location rather than and changing climate conditions, but we'll see Saskatchewan being evacuated as a precautionary measure at the very least. Forest fires, and sometimes that can be a contentious point for how much climate change impacts that, but we do see an increase in fire spread days, so those high wind, high heat, dry days. So there is the concern that rather than a greater total number of forest fires, we can see larger ones where more communities are evacuated at once to test capacity. So for us, well, it's hard to say whether or not the increase in evacuations is due to climate factors on their own. The link between the underlying factors and the services that we try to provide, right? The links are there, and it's something where we have to plan for it, and we have to do our best to make sure that we are in a position to support these communities when they are experiencing these risks.
Thank you. All right, I've got my eye on the time, and I know we're coming up to the half hour, so I think we'll take one more question from the audience, and then we'll call it. So our final question comes from Michelina, who is another student in our graduate program, and she has a question for all of you. Have you seen an increased interest in climate adaptation, particularly from residents, or maybe interest or support? And maybe we could start with you, Katie.
Oh, okay, I think I lost me now. It's hard to say. I think when we were developing our plan, we did have an external stakeholder group that had a lot of members from the community. And when we were out doing public consultation, there was a lot of public interest. We haven't done a lot of communications on our project as of late, so I haven't had too many questions trickling in. It's a little hard to judge at the moment.
Yeah, I imagine COVID has also disconnected us from a lot of our face-to-face that we used to be able to have. Thank you, Katie.
Maybe I can jump in on this one. So I think at the moment, we kind of feel that we're still pushing people who don't know they have risk, basically. I think because we don't have, at the moment in Canada, really publicly available user-friendly flood maps, for example, that people can type in their address and find out where the flood risk, like whether it's from rivers or intense rainfall or coast, and how it's going to change in the future. I don't feel people really appreciate the level of risk, and I still feel like at the Intech Center we're still providing information for people, but there needs to be a demand for that information. Should be increasing, really. And I think the launch of Flood Factor in the US is a very user-friendly. It's a score of flood risk and shows also different future horizons. I think something like that, and then the follow through to put that on real estate sales sheets, for example, once it starts appearing in everyday life, then people are going to think it's more real. At the moment, I think, I know where to check for my flood risk maps, but they're not readily accessible to the general public. You need to go and search for them very much. It's not something that pops. So if people start seeing it on when they're buying a house, on a mortgage statement, or on a house inspection checklist, or these everyday things that we do, and we don't avoid, or like they get information with their taxes, for example, that they definitely open. I think that's when people are going to really appreciate the risk.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. I love that. That's been a reoccurring thread throughout this conversation, is the normalization of it and the mainstreaming of it across, so that people, it's not just the minority who are very highly interested that will go track this stuff down, but making all those examples that you provided would be beautiful on the real estate, on the
and I think the sad thing is the people who are really savvy about it are the people who've already suffered. You know, the people who are the experts in their community are the people who've been flooded and have lost a lot already, or that have, you know, experienced loved ones that have suffered from extreme heat consequences. Those are the people who, and we want to kind of avoid this management by disaster.
Absolutely. And shift from just responding to stuff once it's happened and once you've experienced it personally, but being genuinely aware and prepared for the increasing risk. Jacob, any comments on whether you've seen an increased interest or support from your community?
Yeah, building off Joanna's point, I think that there's often that risk of preparing for the last disaster you experienced, no matter what the future risk that you're expecting to see is. So I know that, so in Thunder Bay, we experienced extreme flooding in 2008, 2012, 2016. And so after those, we had very high level of interest in a lot of these initiatives, which now, keeping that interest going and not relying on a disaster to drive this interest can be more challenging. And sometimes you do see the division of, like, I think in the past year or a little bit longer out, the past year, COVID was a bit of a distraction. We have seen bases be immobilized, and people, a stronger group of people in general, care about climate change and ask people about climate change and demonstrate on climate change. But sometimes it can be difficult to separate what these groups are doing versus other bubbles of people with other concerns. So I know that the people who I work with as stakeholders, they are very interested in this right now. But I'm also concerned that more work needs to be done on crossing some of these communication gaps and engaging some of the people who are currently still resistant, still won't feel a personal connection to climate change, or it's just so far from their highest concerns that they aren't driving for change.
Thank you. Well, we're almost at the half hour, so I think I will have to stop us there. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our three panelists. Your experiences and stories of where you've seen real success in implementation is so important for us as we continue these conversations to try and mainstream, normalize, push action forward in the region. So thank you so much to the three of you. Thanks to the organizing committee, and thank you so much to the audience for joining us. You know, these conversations are integral for shifting the dial on what we consider to be the standard and how we actually demand more action in this space. As a final point, I just remind you that we will upload a recording of this onto our YouTube channel. So in about a week or so, it will be available if you'd like to come back to it, revisit it. I know lots of great resources were shared here. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, and happy Thursday. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.